It's funny when I first reached out to you, I was thinking it was, a couple weeks before the election. I was thinking we could do a kind of evergreen episode about Diddy or Epstein or the extent to which these
Yeah.
so quote unquote conspiracy theories might be informing our political moment and what we can learn from them. And now I've seen you do a lot of really interesting coverage about the implications of various Trump appointees, again relating to some of these, I don't know, how do you describe them? Um, Sub-political connections that are driving our politics. And
Oh,
that
sure.
is
Mhm.
it does feel very topical, frankly, and interesting. I do find myself like, I wanna confess to you that, like, apart from being on Rising, where there was a lot of audience interest in this stuff, I haven't personally dipped my toe into these waters, and I am a little apprehensive about it at the same just because I don't know very much. I don't know enough to, hypothetically push back in the way that I would on a different subject area. But I know that that's a deficit of my own, and that's part of why I really want to talk to you because you're so knowledgeable and you have such a wealth of knowledge over all of these different issue areas. So maybe the best thing I should do is to ask you, what do you think is most useful for this bad faith audience who obviously like listens to other shows, but here in this context hasn't gone very far down many of these rabbit holes? What do
Sure.
you think they should know? A relatively normie audience on these things.
Yeah, so I guess I would start off by saying that in general, the way I've sort of approached my whole career is trying to build common ground, generally speaking, from on between the anti-war left and like the anti-war right, libertarians maybe, I guess, or people more of that bent, about common policies that tend to be bipartisan that I think are very Orwellian or very bad. Um, and really benefit, more of the oligarch class, and sort of the idea that like both political parties really ultimately serve the same masters and advance the same policy agendas, but their sales pitches for those agendas are different. And so there's a couple of those agendas that I focused on throughout my career, aside from the Epstein stuff, which ended up being more focused on sex blackmail and sort of the formation of intelligence agencies, both in the US and Israel, and sort of the overlaps there. But a lot of my work is focused on, uh, and it sort of has informed a lot of my coverage of the incoming Trump administration, sort of on, Peter Thiel, Palantir, and some of these, contractor companies that definitely play both sides, and which are advanced by both Democrats and Republicans, ultimately with the goal of sort of weaponizing um, the national security state against domestic dissent. And
Mm,
how I think what I worry about now with the incoming Trump administration is that they'll continue that same policy, even though they complained about it a lot under, Biden and the Biden and Harris administration, but will advance it under the guise of combating anti-Semitism, which has now been conflated with criticism of the Israeli state, for example. And I can talk a lot about Palantir and where they come from. They're really a rebrand of a neocon program from the Bush era. Um, and I think that's kind of important to broach because Peter Thiel and Elon Musk and all of these PayPal mafia guys have tried to rebrand themselves as libertarians, and they're very clearly not that.
all right, so that was a perfect setup, and if I can use that as a cold open, you've been listening to Whitney Webb. She is a investigative journalist, formerly at Mint Press News, and also the author of One Nation Under Blackmail. Welcome to Bad Faith, Whitney.
That's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me on.
I mean, as I was saying, I have been eager to talk to you, a little overwhelmed at the prospect because of how your area of journalistic focus, your various areas of journalistic focus, like very much overlap with my own blind spots. So I am using this as an opportunity to sort of presume that the audience has some of those blind spots as well, and to get you to fill this in. And I really do want you to feel free to guide this conversation to the places that you think a relatively normie audience should go and what they need to know to start viewing some of this information maybe in a less conspiratorial light than it is viewed or as it's depicted in the mainstream, and to really understand what are the factors that are motivating so many of the political appointments that are being made today, and the direction of our uniparty, more broadly speaking. So you brought up the fact that Peter Thiel and Elon Musk are people who have branded themselves as libertarians, but this is a relatively new uh, identification for them. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So Peter Thiel has openly labeled himself a libertarian, and this has sort of been adopted by both his critics and his acolytes for really quite a long time, but it really doesn't make very much sense. For example, Peter Thiel is on video and also in his writings has referred to, for example, a free market competition as being for losers, and his definition of a capitalist is someone who accrues capital. So the most capitalist person is the person that's holding the most capital, or the
Mm,
richest person in the world. And he argues that the best way to do business is to build monopolies, find a niche, corner it, and build a monopoly. And when Peter Thiel has done that in his own business, he's done it in direct collaboration with three-letter agencies. He did that when he helped create PayPal. And of course, later on when he created Palantir, which he did with the direct involvement of several neoconservative figures from the Bush administration, Richard Pearl, John Poindexter, and some others. And then, of course, became very involved with the CIA, particularly the CIA VC firm In-Q-Tel, in order to produce this company. Palantir, which was really an effort to repackage a Bush era, a post 9/11 sort of Patriot Act era program that was housed within the Pentagon's DARPA called Total Information Awareness, which was widely criticized by the ACLU and a lot of these other advocate groups, I guess you could say, in that era, arguing it would eliminate individual privacy, and basically gut the Constitution and a lot of the protections that American citizens have, which is arguably very true. But they realized that if they rebranded this as a private sector program and removed the public sector from it, that perhaps people wouldn't complain. And that was sort of the impetus for Palantir. And so Peter Thiel and Alex Karp, when they were creating it, went to John Poindexter, who is probably best known for being the highest ranking member of the Iran or of the Reagan administration to be prosecuted for his role in the Iran-Contra scandal. He was brought back for the Bush administration to run this program, and at the time was considered the godfather of modern surveillance, because part of what he did is part of his involvement in the Iran-Contra scandal was sort of set up some of these protocols and be involved in other scandals of that era, largely forgotten, that also involved surveilling domestic dissent in the United States. And so Palantir was really sort of an effort to privatize that. And, if
mm,
it's a private company, it doesn't have to necessarily follow all the rules that it would have to if it was a public sector program. So the decision was made to privatize it. And there was also another DARPA era program that was related to total information awareness that was called LifeLog, which bears a lot of similarities to Facebook, which was actually launched the same day that LifeLog was shut down, in the same era of these DARPA programs being sort of shut down and then relaunched as private sector versions. And then Peter Thiel becomes intimately involved in creating early Facebook and shaping it, and remained on its board for a very long time, and shaped a lot of its policies, including its involvement, for example, in unconstitutional surveillance, where Facebook collaborated along with a lot of other large Silicon Valley companies with the NSA to surveil Americans, for example. And of course, Palantir scrapes all of that data that's on Facebook and social media and uses that to regularly profile people, including Americans, and has been used in efforts to, develop predictive policing, which is really pre-crime. And Palantir was openly testing that in minority communities in New Orleans and some other parts of the United States, and trying to develop basically a way to outsource law enforcement and a lot of national security policy, also domestically, basically have an AI algorithm run it. And unfortunately, we're sort of at a point where there's probably going to be efforts, most likely under the incoming Trump administration, under the guise of increasing government efficiency, to put AI in increasingly powerful roles, in government, including in law enforcement and other things. And Palantir is a harbinger of that. And I think, if you look at its history, its CIA involvement, people like Peter Thiel and what this program has actually done and what it has, how it has developed, It's very concerning. So like in the COVID era too, Palantir was granted pretty much unfettered access to American health data and also to all the NHS health data in Britain on government contracts. And there's um, really no meaningful oversight of what Palantir does with that, with people's health data and their history of targeting minorities in particular, and also labeling Americans subversives for intelligence agencies based on Americans' online activity. This is a very troubling company. It's very not, nothing about it is libertarian or civil liberty minded at all, despite the fact that Peter Thiel frames himself that way. They're also very willing collaborators of this proliferation of AI weapons. You can see that with their intimate involvement in the genocide in Gaza going on right now, and how they've
Mm.
facilitated a lot of these AI kill lists and things that have been used by the IDF, that are not transparent, but are being used to decide if people live or die based on, an AI algorithm deciding how close they're affiliated with an alleged Hamas member
If
and
they're on the
things of
same
that
cell
nature.
phone plan, all of that kind of thing that we covered back months ago, right? It's so there's a lot in there. I wondered if we could take just a step back and talk about just Peter Thiel, how he got his wealth, obviously through PayPal, but the shift to Palantir and what is framed as a data analytics company. I think there might be some naivete, just lack of knowledge about the gap between how Palantir kind of presents itself as, a Silicon Valley company that does what tech companies do versus a company that has all of its fingers in all of these kinds of really insidious pots. And then also, if maybe you could help us understand how they have been able to act in this way and Peter Thiel frame himself as someone who's a civil libertarian in the context of a political movement on the right that does seem to, at very least superficially, or among a certain segment of the base, have a genuine concern in some of the suppressive instincts of social media companies, banking apps, and the like.
Mm-hmm.
What have we seen from elected Republican officials vis-a-vis Teal and Palantir, and has there been any pushback on the right against some of the actions that you've described Palantir is so deeply involved in?
Yeah, there's actually very little pushback against anything involving Peter Thiel on the right, which I actually find very surprising. But it's
Mm,
really not that surprising when you consider that a lot of prominent independent figures and figures that recently became quote unquote independent, in alternative or independent media, like Tucker Carlson, for example, financed by Peter Thiel.
mm.
Rumble, the biggest competitor to YouTube, largely financed by Peter Thiel, and also the man whose career was largely entirely really made by Peter Thiel, J.D. Vance, who's now supposed to be or is set to be the vice president of the next administration. And there's really no shortage of Thiel connections to a lot of these media startups, or a lot of these sort of big figures that have become prominent in the most recent iteration of the Trump campaign and incoming Trump administration, like Vivek Ramaswamy, for example. His VC firm, largely capitalized by Thiel, and also Howard Lutnick, who's now the co-chair of Trump's transition team and is picking the talent, as he says it, for the incoming Trump administration. And of course, Lutnick himself was also a major figure in the creation of Rumble, helping it go public via SPAC through his company, Cantor Fitzgerald. So a lot of these actors are very involved in sort of the a media complex that has formed as, in opposition to mainstream media, which is understandable in the sense that mainstream media has told lots of egregious lies, lied us into wars numerous times, and various other things of that nature. But I think it would be naive to assume that some of these actors would not then attempt to weaponize independent media as an effort to rebuild trust and then push similar talking points when they know that mainstream media has totally destroyed its credibility with a large segment of the American population, particularly on the right. Um,
I wonder what you do with that personally. I mean, I have felt this tension of understanding that people are getting their videos taken down, getting demonetized, getting fully barred from apps for example, coverage that's critical of Israel, but myriad other things even before October 7th. And the emergence of platforms like Rumble do seem like a safety valve for content creators who otherwise feel deeply constrained. And I think that there are, people in this sphere who I respect who have taken up on that opportunity. How do you personally feel about the ability to sort of not succumb to, I think you described it as kind of, I forget the words you use, but the preferred narrative being pushed by a Teal-like figure while still taking advantage of the existence of a platform like that? There
Yeah,
was, Patreon, for instance, came under criticism for censorship, and that made Substack seem like a
yeah,
more
they
appealing
censored
option.
my
And then for
account.
Right. Okay.
So,
Great example. And then Substack got stigmatized as sort of right leaning for a while until enough people joined it
sure.
that it now is, like the air that we breathe. No one thinks of it that way anymore. And I think the hope was, or hope is ultimately that Rumble will similarly have a transition and be an equivalent to YouTube, but without the quote unquote censorship. I mean, the accusation like Teal backed, for instance, is thrown around in a way that sometimes I think accurately points to kind of a bias, like a political ideological bias, and sometimes is used to describe someone who happens to be on a certain platform. Or maybe those things have an inextricable relationship to each other. What do you think about it?
Well, I think in the case of Peter Thiel, it's important to remember that he built Palantir specifically with the CIA. The CIA was the Palantir's only client for its first several years as a company. It took people from Langley to tell them how to develop their product and has been intimately related to them really ever since. And that Peter Thiel has a long history of collaborating with the national security agencies. And a big part of that is getting people to surrender their data willingly online and then have
Mm-hmm.
these contractors sort of suck that up and then profile people based on what they're saying, or not just what they're saying or commenting, but also what content they are consuming, what they're viewing, and things of that nature. So my concern about Rumble is more sort of in that sphere, and I'm not certainly going to judge anybody from ditching YouTube for Rumble, especially when you consider that Google also has national security ties to its origins, and also the fact that the co-founders of Google were definitely implicated in the Epstein scandal, for example. So I'm not trying to say YouTube is much better. But in the case of Rumble, something I have noticed is that the biggest accounts on that seem to sort of be homogenous in terms of their takes and their views on certain things. And I know that those large accounts do get financial incentives from the company Rumble, but I don't think that's true for every creator that posts their content on Rumble. And I think when you have the biggest accounts that are obviously going to be the most viewed and the most obvious on the homepage, all sort of saying the same thing, that can sort of have an effect on how people that get most of their video related content or video related news content from Rumble are going to be consuming the same thing, hearing the same thing, maybe from a few different shows. But that homogeneity can sort of manufacture consent or create sort of influence people to significant degrees.
I mean, full disclosure, I was approached to have a Rumble channel as well, just like the David Sachs funded app Callin had me do a
Hmm.
show over there as well. And as it was told to me, it's like, well, we don't want it to seem like a right wing app. We want a diversity of creators, ostensibly, so it's not the case. I'm putting quotation marks up, but so that it's not the
Hmm.
case that there's a homogeneity of viewpoint and everyone feels like they can come on the app and it attracts a broader audience. The argument being, well, at the end of the day, we're capitalists. We just want to make money. We want everyone who, would be on YouTube to also come over here. And for me, the appeal of having the Collins show is like I love to be at a place where I didn't have to ask my followers for money. So to me, I'm like, if David Sachs wants to give me some money so that I can say left wing things to a left wing audience, there's no skin off my back. And I do wonder if it's a chicken or the egg situation, like non whatever you want to call it, however you want to describe the politics that is predominant on Rumble. But let's just say lefties or liberals even don't want to go on Rumble because they see it as a place that where their views aren't reflected, and therefore it becomes a place where their views aren't reflected. Versus we are funding people because certainly those aren't my views, but there was an interest in getting me to come onto the app.
Yeah, I understand. Well, I think the formation of echo chambers isn't helpful. I don't think echo chambers are good. And I think, homogeneity of content creates a homogeneity of thought, which isn't necessarily good. We should have differing viewpoints. Be first to interact with that. People should be able to think critically, look at a vast variety of opinions and come to their own conclusions without being pressured by someone. To do that. But in the case of like what these people's, motives may be. So for example, you brought up David Sachs, who's a member of the so-called PayPal mafia, the people that were, top executives at PayPal and have since gone on to make a myriad of other companies. I think it's important to keep in mind that, a lot has been said about the world, especially the world economy, moving to a post-oil economy and to a data economy. And so you have had, numerous people and analysts say that data is the new oil in this world. And so instead of having oil barons like we had in the industrial age, like the Rockefellers and whatnot, I think there is a race underway to have people develop platforms and try and position themselves as the data barons of the data economy age. Right. And so if you're like Elon Musk, for example, and you openly purchase Twitter because you want, well, he said it was about free speech, but he also said it was about creating an everything app. And that includes his ambition to turn X, formerly Twitter, into a bank, which he aims to be half of the financial system. If you have people living their entire lives on an app and doing all of their finances and most of their communicating and their consumption of media all on one app, then you have a wealth of data that you can extract from people and then monetize and sell. And that is what pretty much every social media platform does to make all the money that they have, is monetize data that users put out. And then sell it to whoever. And a lot of it is sold to advertisers, but some of it is also sold to government intelligence agencies. And so the fact that you have, people like Peter Thiel in the mix, who created a company that sucks up that data and then uses it to profile people and put them on a quote unquote naughty list for the CIA or any of these other, three-letter agencies that have been, particularly within networks that have been not necessarily open, but there's a very documentable trajectory of them being interested in ways to clamp down on domestic dissent, particularly if there is mass nonviolent opposition to an American war abroad and things of that nature. These are things that I think should be very concerning to Americans. And so even if people are writing in claiming that they're all about free speech and promoting that, I think their actual ambitions are probably something very different. And so, it's not just what I explained about Elon Musk a second ago. We must also consider that he's one of the main contractors to the Pentagon space program. He's openly building the satellites for intelligence agencies. He's very openly a collaborator with these intelligence agencies that have not, whose, the only time there was a congressional investigation into them was in the 70s, and there was never any accountability. And so when that message is sent, they're going to continue to do their, illegal criminal behavior, especially if they feel like they can get away with it, which they have for a very long time. And so I think, we're in this new, very interesting phase, but I don't really necessarily think it's good, where we're sort of having these oligarchs trying to sort of celebritize themselves and try and build these popular platforms around these particular talking points. But I don't think that's where their motives really lie, because just like in politics, when you're dealing with, oligarchs like this, because frankly, that's what people like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk are, you should also be following the money and following their incentives and things of that nature. And I think the outsized role of Silicon Valley figures like those in politics is very significant, because there really has been a fusion over the past decade plus of Silicon Valley and the national security state, to the point where you have someone like Eric Schmidt, the former CIA or CEO of Google, basically running the commission that determines how the national security community is going to use AI. As part of the National Security Commission on AI a few years ago. Why is he in charge of that? And he actually works relatively closely with Peter Thiel at sort of these global conferences where there's meetings of leaders behind closed doors, like the Bilderberg Conference, for example. So I think a lot of their disagreements, Eric Schmidt was a big backer of Hillary Clinton in 2016. Peter Thiel was a big backer of Donald Trump in 2016. For example, they play both sides, but ultimately they agree on a lot of the same policies and where they want to see the global economy or just the world society in general go. And I think ultimately it's a lot about playing people off of each other, divide and conquer, and sort of pushing us towards the same policies, but sort of seeing which sales pitches will fit best with certain demographics, right?
Yeah.
So, for example, there's this push to sort of create a government-issued digital ID. And so, for example, in the case of the United Kingdom, you had the Tories, the conservatives, sell it as a necessary way to resolve the migration crisis over there. But then the Labour Party comes in and pushes for the same thing, but says it's necessary to stop cyberbullying and online hate and hate speech and all of this stuff. So the sales pitches are different, but the policies lead to the same places. And unsurprisingly, in the United States, it's actually been pretty similar to what's going on in the UK, to the point that you have Trump essentially pushing for that same system under the guise of controlling immigration issues, which of course are of major concern to his base. And the person that he just made his border czar, Tom Homan, was a major advocate for this biometric entry exit system for all people entering and leaving the US, which of course would include any American citizen that wishes to travel abroad.
It feels surreal that after years of hand-wringing about the inappropriate relationship between a company like Twitter and, say, the US government, at least when run by Democrats, because that's always the framing, with the Twitter files coverage and the, I think, appropriate frustration over the suppression of the Hunter Biden laptop scandal, but all of that, for there to be so little in the way of legal barriers to these Silicon Valley companies wantonly sharing public information with three-letter agencies. Has any of the political pushback, the hearings around the Twitter files, any of that germinated any effort to legally bar or at least constrain the relationship between these companies and the intelligence agencies?
Not really that I've seen, but I mean, maybe it will change if people get frustrated enough with it. But I think a lot of these actors, including Elon Musk, for example, that sort of was a genesis type figure for the Twitter files, there is a goal to sort of frame the quote unquote deep state, as it's called, as Democrat only, and sort of paint the idea that the face of the quote unquote deep state are elected Democrat officials, when in reality, the whole concept of the deep state, which is a term I don't even like to use because it's been so weaponized that it's really meaningless at this point. Um, what it's supposed to refer to are the fact that no matter who is elected to office, there is a group of unelected bureaucrats that run most of the federal government, and that, a certain party can come to power, but certain policies will stay there irrespective if a Democrat wins or a Republican wins. And that's why we get progressively more wars, why American wealth continues to get pilfered, why Larry Flink's BlackRock always seems to be in charge of U.S. fiscal policy when there is an economic crisis of some type, and things of that nature. There's a lot of other examples I could give as well. But ultimately, it leads, to less freedom for us, at least in the post 9/11 era, and more control and power for the government over our lives, regardless of what party is in power. And the idea that it's a purely partisan entity, I think, is actually shows that it's being weaponized for political purposes, because if you're going to frame it as, for example, Donald Trump is the man who's going to take down the deep state, and you have redefined deep state not to mean this unelected bureaucracy that puts the same policies into motion regardless of who wins, and you make the deep state the opposing political party, then you can justify the weaponization, against supporters of that political party or the political party itself. Not that I'm defending the Democrats, because I think they absolutely have done the same thing. But it's really, Republicans and a lot of Trump voters were outraged by that weaponization, and would they support the weaponization against the other side in the same way? And unfortunately, I think it is absolutely possible, because I think the American public has become sort of conditioned and manipulated to being authoritarian whenever their side is in charge, or the side they feel represents them is in charge.
It was incredibly frustrating, I gotta say, covering the Twitter files, because while I can accept the journalistic merit of discussing, reporting on any kind of data dump, it felt obvious at the time that the purpose of Elon Musk doing it was to create this narrative framing that, look, it's the Democrats who are really the problem. And one of the most obvious signposts of this is the choice of what documents to reveal. Certainly nothing from when he was the CEO of Twitter, only time-stamped documents from before he could be tied to the continued relationship between big tech and the government. Not and my, to the extent that I was critical of the project, it was only because I felt like some of the reporters were not taking that context into account and caveating their findings for the audience to make it very clear that we were only looking at a small piece of the puzzle. We might only be handling the proverbial elephant's tail, right? And not understanding the whole beast that we're dealing with. And now it feels like we are living in a world that has been in part a creation of that sort of reporting where it seems based on a lot of these appointments, the Republicans are moving with relative impunity to doing the exact same kind of weaponization of the federal government and quote unquote, all of the things that they accuse Democrats of doing, largely with impunity. I want to give you a chance to respond and to maybe talk about what you see as sort of the biggest points of hypocrisy or betrayal to what may or may not be a good faith base who really is interested in this sort of things from the Trump administration so far, or the pending Trump administration so far.
Well, really, first, I want to touch on what you said about the Twitter files because I
Please.
have some very strong opinions about that as well. I think there has been a dramatic effort to redefine leaks-based journalism ever since WikiLeaks came
Hmm.
under U.S. government fire, I guess you could say, and Julian Assange was unjustly imprisoned in Britain for several years, which again happened under the Trump administration. And I think, if you recall how WikiLeaks did it, they would release the data dump. The files were available to everyone, journalists and the public, and people were free to search and go through the information and verify it for themselves. Then we have someone sort of come out and privatize the Snowden leaks in the form of The Intercept, which was created by Pierre Omidyar, the eBay billionaire who at the time also, I think, owned PayPal, or maybe he divested shortly before then. Essentially more than 90% of the Snowden leaks were never made public. And certain stories out of this large data dump, which should have arguably been made public, like the WikiLeaks style, were instead sort of trickled out. Only certain stories were chosen to be reported on out of this 90+%. What else was there? The public doesn't know. We have to trust a small select of journalists that are all on the payroll of the Silicon Valley billionaire. To trust them that there was nothing in the public interest there, if some have argued,
Yeah.
and then subsequently we have the Twitter files, where another Silicon Valley billionaire, also tied to PayPal, interestingly enough, come and instead of even allowing the journalists direct access to the data dump, they are told that they can go through lawyers, as I believe it was, and ask for certain terms to be searched for,
That's
and
right.
then certain things are returned to them. And then instead of having those full documents that they're reporting on be available to the public, the form that it's transmitted to the public are screenshots that are made available on Twitter and not the full document itself. So you've gotten to a point where now the standard for leaks-based journalism is not what WikiLeaks introduced to the public, which was arguably in the public's best interest. It is now the Twitter files version, where it's just screenshots are enough, and that's how you're able to have people on Twitter create fake emails and then say this person did this, or this person's a
Hmm.
pedophile or something, and it's not
Hmm.
real. But because this whole screenshot mentality of leaks-based journalism has been established, it can give those sorts of stories credibility and have people sort of take it at face value and not ask for the source or for the document or things of that nature. So I think that is actually kind of a troubling development. And it's interesting that one of the people that was most in, one of the most prominent names in sort of the Twitter files, Matt Taibbi, had previously been sort of courted by Pierre Omidyar for The Intercept, but it ended up working out for them. But he was eager to collaborate with another Silicon Valley billionaire. And why are the Silicon Valley billionaires necessary to provide us with leaks, especially when they have ties to the national security state, as does Elon Musk
Hmm.
and as did Pierre, Omidyar. Elon Musk, closer to the Republican Party, Pierre Omidyar, a major donor Democrat, a donor to the Democrats, who I think visited the Obama White House more than any other figure in Silicon Valley when Obama was in office. But you have them sort of doing similar things and neutering what was viewed as a national security threat, sort of this WikiLeaks style dump to the public and transparency to the public. It was, a bipartisanly viewed as a negative thing. And now we're at this point where the total idea of leaks-based journalism has been completely redefined and reduced to the point where it can be easily manipulated, quite frankly. And I think people would kind of be wise to interrogate why that might be and who that might serve.
Yeah, honestly, your perspective on this is really illuminating. I remember, as I recall it, part of Glenn Greenwald's frustration with The Intercept and desire to leave was because he felt like The Intercept no longer had any interest in reporting on its document trove, and that it was basically like, we got all the stuff, we don't want to do this anymore, and we're also not going to make it public. So even the criticism I think that you have of that Piero Midyar intercept model which I think is legitimate, to see that even devolve further into the Twitter files model does really point to a corruption I think is not being sufficiently talked about. I will say, when I raised these concerns to Matt Taibbi, I became framed as someone who just hated on Matt Taibbi and was like an enemy of journalism and all these kinds of things. But when I had Glenn Greenwald on the show to ask him about how he thought the Twitter files were being conducted, he said, and maybe we should insert the clip here in post, that he personally would not have taken on that project, in part because of the issues that we've just flagged about it potentially being a misrepresentative, skewed sample of documents in the first place, and not wanting to be a useful idiot, not to use the name of Matt Taibbi's former podcast. People do that all the time to me with bad faith, but not to be a useful idiot of whatever Elon Musk's agenda is.
I probably would not have felt totally comfortable, to be honest, with the way in which it was done, in the sense that they were the guardians of the information, and the only information that you end up getting is information they decide to give you. And I'm not willing to kind of be manipulated by the possibility that people are handpicking what they want me to see or don't want me to see, because that can end up causing me or putting me in the position where I'm unwittingly serving as a spokesperson for an agenda that is not mine.
Glenn, isn't that kind of a big deal? Isn't that kind of a significant critique? And I think probably one of the only good faith critiques that's come down about everybody, including people whose journalism I respect so much, like Matt Taibbi, is that if you aren't able to have direct access to the primary documents, if you are, to your point, being served up some kind of sliver. I mean, I've seen Matt asked in like a call-in situation, what about censorship of the left? And he said, well, I just haven't seen very much of that. And maybe that's true. Maybe Twitter just had not that much interest in censoring the left. Fine. But when you are only getting a piece of the pie, it puts someone who is a good faith actor like Matt Taibbi in the position of making a representation, like Twitter wasn't that focused on censoring the left, that he might not be able to realistically speak to truthfully because he only has a piece of the picture.
Right. All he can say is, I didn't see it. And the reason he maybe didn't see it is because he wasn't shown it. So I guess, like, you know, again, first of all, let me just say that there were no real left-wing journalists brought in, although like a framework that doesn't count Matt Taibbi and Li Feng as leftist is one that I don't fully trust. But like, it is true that people who are, say, like a real leftist were not brought in. But notice as well that there were no real like MAGA journalists or far right journalists. They didn't invite Breitbart in or, you know, Charlie Kirk in. I mean, I think Elon's vision of politics is a little bit simplistic. He thinks he's supposed to avoid the far left and the far right, and the people in the middle are the ones you trust. And to him, the middle is Barry Weiss, Matt Taibbi, Michael Schellenberger, these kind of people. And I think that was sort of what guided him. The critique that you're making, that you only get what the source shows you, and therefore the source may end up being able to manipulate your journalism, is completely correct. All I'm saying, once again, though, is that this is always how it is.
And I do think that as their relationship devolved, Bari Weiss, ironically, being the first Twitter Files journalist to kind of be kicked out when she asked for the bare minimum of sort of ideological consistency from Elon Musk, as he was banning Twitter users for reporting on things that were unfavorable to him, or covering the Elon Jets account and all of that sort of thing, to then finally the relationship with Matt Taibbi crumbling. And we saw the leaked DMs and Matt Taibbi basically acknowledging that he was sort of holding back on criticism of Elon Musk in order to maintain access, it really begs the question, is it really worth it to maintain access to such a sort of obviously skewed segment of data that's only being given to you for the purposes of burnishing Elon Musk's reputation? It seems increasingly obvious. I don't know. What do you think that's fair?
I think a lot of
Am I
people
overreaching?
now are sort of in that position that Taibbi is because of X monetizations features, and people have become dependent on that and feel, perhaps it's true, that if they are more, friendly to Elon, for example, they will be signal boosted by him on the platform, or perhaps get more monetization. And of course, if Elon Musk does retweet you as the most boosted account on the entire platform, period, you're going to get more views and great increased metrics, and that is going to benefit how much money you make from its monetization feature. So I think that is kind of concerning. As far as Glenn Greenwald goes, I can't quite remember exactly why he left The Intercept, but I do know that by the time the Snowden archive was shuttered, the big critics of it were Laura Poitras and some other people, and Glenn Greenwald defended the argument that it was shuttered due to cost. He and I had some back and forth a few years ago, because when he was still at The Intercept, because I was reporting relatively critically on it, some of the things I mentioned earlier, also Pierre Omidyar's ties to the national security state, and also the fact that 3 of the people that provided leaks to them that were not Snowden after Snowden, like Reality Winner, for example, were essentially burned by the journalists that had taken their information, and sentenced to prison. Daniel Hale being another one. And the question is, how did that happen? How did it happen 3 times, especially when the organization framed itself as being safe for leakers or whistleblowers because of the Snowden case, right?
Yeah.
So, I find that concerning. And Glenn Greenwald was very dismissive of my concerns at the time. Maybe he will not be now because he, has seemingly changed opinion about, The Intercept as an organization and things of that nature. But again, we don't really talk, so I don't really know.
Well, look, if I can be helpful in brokering that conversation, I would be happy to, because I'm finding you to be incredibly knowledgeable and persuasive and interesting. And I respect Glenn as well. And I have found him to be very receptive to pushback, both on panels on this show and elsewhere. Not that I have to be a part of it, but if I can facilitate in any way, do let me know, because that's something that I would like to watch, whether or not it happens here. I want to come back to this point that you made in the very beginning, that part of what has driven your journalistic focus and driven your politics is this idea that we do have a uniparty, that we're seeing the same powers control the deep state, the undemocratic government. I know you said you didn't prefer the term deep space, 3-letter agency, whatever, however you want to call it, regardless of which party is in power, and that your reporting makes that clear. I think that there has been at least some pushback, maybe it's just on Twitter, to some of the Trump appointments from people who maybe naively believed that things would be different under a Trump administration. And since there is so much chatter right now about these appointments, I did wonder if you could maybe give your analysis of what's been going on there and why, and who's disgruntled, what kinds of picks are raising what kinds of red flags for folks. Yeah.
Sure. Well, I think a lot of the surprise ultimately comes down to people not really remembering very well what happened during the first Trump administration, and also really being sold the idea that this time would be very different. And I think it's, with the cabinet appointments that had been announced thus far, I think it's very clear that it's going to be most likely very similar to when Trump was in office the first time, because, for example, there's a lot of examples of this, but Trump campaigned on things like reinstating Glass-Steagall, for example. And then instead, when he got in office, he further deregulated the banking industry. He deregulated biotechnology and GMO crops to the point that small farmer organizations and organic farmer organizations sued the federal government over that executive order. But instead, his campaign this time sort of sold itself as we're going to make America healthy again. Sort of implicit in that is a reduction in the prevalence of GMOs in the food supply and in agriculture. But of course, J.D. Vance and a lot of other Elon Musk, Joe Lonsdale, a lot of very prominent, very wealthy Trump donors, in addition to the VP himself, are very heavily invested in biotechnology. And so a lot of people, again, I think, and it happens every 4 years, often to either side of the political divide, can get very swept up in political rhetoric. And when they do so, have a tendency to sort of forget the historical antecedents, particularly if that politician had been in office before, which in the case of Trump was true. And then sort of very wrapped up in the campaign sales pitches, which is ultimately what they are. If you look at modern U.S. political history, the amount of presidents that have kept their campaign promises is pretty much non-existent. And I think, unfortunately, that trend continues, and I see no reason why it would not. And I think the problem, again, of not really knowing a lot of the things Trump did in office. So, for example, his previous Attorney General, Bill Barr, legalized pre-crime in the United States by creating a Department of Justice program called DEEP that was allegedly marketed as preventing mass shooters before they can strike. I talked earlier about how Palantir has been working on developing this kind of pre-crime functionality predictive policing for U.S. law enforcement, the FBI, and other groups. Will that continue in the next Trump administration? Or some of these efforts, for example, that were in the previous administration to profile Americans off of their social media activity and decide if they might be showing early warning signs of neuropsychiatric violence and should they be sent to a court-ordered physician or put under house arrest. This was stuff that was pitched to Trump by Jared Kushner and Ivanka, and a very close friend of Donald Trump's named Bob Wright. And they were pitching the creation of this agency called ARPA, a health DARPA. And it was actually created by Biden, called ARPA-H. But instead of having that program I just mentioned as its flagship program, by the Biden administration sold it as a cancer development moonshot. But ultimately, the same architects of the ARPA program pitched to Trump by Bob Wright and Kushner and whatever, they're the same as the people that designed and created ARPA-H. So this is an example of these bipartisan things and how people I think also social media facilitates sort of the memory thing because we're so bombarded by current things and there's so little context. And, people kind of just scroll constantly for little sound bites and things like that. No one really reads long form investigative journalism anymore and things like that. So it's downwind of that, it's very obvious, I think, why people don't remember, but I think remembering it is important. And the fact that, someone brings that up and is like, maybe we should be skeptical because of what happened last time. Let's remember what happened last time so we don't repeat our mistakes. Or, I'm treated as a doom pillar, or I'm accused of being woke or a Marxist or whatever. When, in the last election cycle, I was criticized, I criticized Biden before then and was accused of being, a Trumper or whatever. I mean, it happens every 4 years if you were willing to, criticize both sides. And again, I think that speaks to sort of this, just the effect that campaigns have on people and the fact that we're so online now as a society and social media can manipulate us so effectively, I think have an influence that a lot of people don't realize. And they think because they're not looking at mainstream media, they're less influenced. I think that sort of allows people to actually be more susceptible. And I think a lot of people don't know how weaponized social media has been by our own national security state. So as an example, the U.S. Air Force had a research program in 2014, so that's 10 years ago, about using social media to control people like drones. That was the description of the program. And now that we have a military contractor running Twitter right now, do you think he would not allow the tools that the Pentagon and these other agencies have poured millions of dollars into for the past 10 years to be used on his platform for the purpose of, manufacturing consent for various policies or various politicians. Or, for example, in the case of Trump's recent cabinet picks, a lot of openly very hawkish figures that are really, some of them could have been appointed to the George W. Bush administration seamlessly. And the idea that he's somehow an anti-neocon guy, I think that's how it happens.
I just wanted to not drop this point about what this health DARPA cancer moonshot was. I mean, I remember Biden campaigning on "We're going to cure cancer," and it just seems such a bizarre non sequitur back in 2020. But understanding, if I'm understanding you correctly, understanding that it was part of some kind of predictive health surveillance, a kind of data program that was intended to do what exactly?
There was an effort to create this agency, initially called ARPA, but it was created under Biden. Like I said earlier, they moved the H to the end with a dash, so it looks slightly different, but it's ARPA-H. And the idea was to create DARPA, which is the Pentagon's advanced research arm, a DARPA equivalent for healthcare in the United States. And so the way Biden pitched it was as a health DARPA, but for curing cancer. Right. But the way it was pitched under Trump and the flagship program it was set to have was this program that the acronym of it is Safe Homes. And it stands for something really long that I can't quite remember off the top of my head now because it's been several years. But this Safe Homes program, the idea of it was that there would be an AI algorithm that would go over all of the social media posts put out by American citizens, and that they would that algorithm would assess those posts and those accounts for early warning signs of neuropsychiatric violence. The idea of it was being pitched as stopping mass shootings before they happen, because I think late 2019, there were a spate of mass shootings in the United States. Trump called on social media giants, actually, at that point in time, to surveil people on its platform to stop mass shooters before it happens. And then this particular policy was being pitched to Trump by Kushner and Ivanka. Allegedly, Trump really liked it, but COVID followed a few months later, so maybe that's why it didn't end up happening. Or maybe he decided he didn't like the program. Again, it's very hard to know, but this is how the health DARPA was initially pitched, at least under the Trump administration, as sort of this pre-crime thing. And if you were determined as part of this program to show those early warning signs of neuropsychiatric violence, there was all these different outcomes there could be, including house arrest and being ordered by a court to go to a particular physician for treatment and things like that, all based on whether an AI decides you posted something inappropriate on social media or something that the AI was programmed to believe indicates a predisposition to violence or something like that, which is complicated because a lot of Americans that aren't violent vent online and sort of scream into the void, and aren't necessarily predisposed to violence. And it's very Orwellian.
Yeah, it is Orwellian. It's very Minority Report. It is also, though, I mean, I find myself I'm reevaluating my views because the version, this is basically red flag laws. No, how is this different from what is considered to be a progressive lefty gun reform?
Well, this is my point, is that this is the efficient tech bro version of red flag laws, and it was being considered, by a Republican administration, and then the Democrats have their own version of essentially what's the same policy at the end of the day. But again, the sales pitch of it is different, and the justification for it given to the public is different. But ultimately, you're getting.
So, I mean, how do we get from that to solving cancer?
Well, when Biden came,
yeah, go ahead.
He framed the creation of this agency by focusing on different programs. But the same architect of ARPA-H is still Bob Wright. And then Jeffrey Ling, I think, is the former DARPA executive that helped create ARPA-H and was intimately involved in the development of the initial idea of HARPA that was pitched to Trump. But again, it's the same agency, it's the same plan. They just slightly retooled it under Biden. And Biden, instead of highlighting the Safe Homes program as its flagship program publicly, chose instead to highlight, moonshot, as he called it, treatments for cancer and things like that. Very experimental treatments for cancer, or developing a cure for cancer using, biotechnology and things of that nature. Mm-hmm.
I do wonder if you've given much thought. I'm sure you have. Maybe the question is, do you have solutions in mind, or what would you advise people who hear about the way their data is being manipulated, hear about the surveillance implications of it all, and are very conflicted about what to do? I mean, we talked a
Mm-hmm.
little bit about this with respect to Rumble or Substack or any number of these apps, which seem like not only good alternatives to the more mainstream apps where censorship is happening, but are also platforms, including Twitter, frankly, which the left has felt provided opportunities to elevate our perspectives when they're being blocked from the mainstream media. And I think probably TikTok is the best example of this, where there is this bipartisan effort, obviously, to ban TikTok under the guise of it being a threat from China, when all of these advocates for the TikTok ban on both sides of the aisle, including Jonathan Greenblatt, have been very clear about how essential the TikTok ban is to suppressing pro-Palestine content and Israel critical content. So it does seem sometimes, if you kind of go by I welcome their hatred, I judge them by how much pushback there is sort of a standard, that there is an obvious benefit for kind of progressive movements, BLM, whatever it is, on these independent media sites. But do you feel like it's naive for us to feel like we're gaining more than we're losing from using these sites? And if so, I mean, what is the alternative?
Well, I use some of these sites too, because there really is, unfortunately, not many other options for people in independent media that take an adversarial approach to power to get their point of view out. And so for the meantime, while that is still able to happen, I'm not going to judge people for using it. But I do think if you are critical of the increasing power that Silicon Valley has over our lives, there are ways to reduce your dependence on it, because maybe there aren't really especially if you're an independent media, useful social media alternatives that will really get your opinion out there. You don't need to use Gmail or Google Business Suite or Microsoft
Mm.
Word, or, for example, there are alternatives to all of those. There are alternatives to Windows and Apple operating systems if you so choose. And they aren't really, a lot has happened over the past several years. They're not as difficult to use as before. And if we allow ourselves to be our lives to be completely dependent on these platforms, and that gives these oligarchs an unprecedented amount of power and influence over our lives. And so I think we should be wary of how much power we're giving to them. And everyone is going to have different red lines about what that is, and I'm not trying to tell anyone what to do, because I'm not really in the business of that. But if you are concerned about these things, I think you should try and reduce your dependence on big tech as much as you possibly can. That does not mean go and buy Eric Prince's unplugged phone that's made by Israeli intelligence veterans, which some people claim is a solution to that, including the Tulsi Gabbard, for example.
Mm.
But there are other alternatives that are open source and not linked to people that ran CIA death squads in the Middle East, like Eric Prince, and that don't have ties to foreign intelligence agencies, that you can use as a some sort of alternative to sort of reduce their power over you. And I think why we have voices on these platforms. It is important to criticize Silicon Valley billionaires, whether they're on the posturing to be on the left, like Reid Hoffman, or posturing to be on the right, like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel. I think we should be critical of the fusion of Silicon Valley with the national security state, and a lot of these other trends that are developing, or the fusion of big pharma with a lot of Silicon Valley firms, for example, that are sort of being incubated in part by this ARPA-H agency that we mentioned earlier. There should be scrutiny of how much power these people are accumulating. And are we really going back to an era that's sort of like the era of like industrial age barons that have extreme control over our lives and workers' lives, to the point where, with devastating consequences, if anyone's familiar with the Rockefeller legacy in the late 1800s and early 1900s, for example? Do we really want to go back to that kind of neo-feudal era in society? And if we don't, we should really look at ways to end our dependence on them, and also resist this pull that their celebrities and things like that, that's people like Elon Musk and some of these other figures have tried to cultivate through their patronage of media. in recent years. And I guess there's more I could say in the way of solutions, but I got kind of hung up on the Silicon Valley part of it. But as far as the two-party paradigm goes, if you're voting for a Democrat or Republican, the tactics to keep you in the box, even if you hate the candidate they force on you, is the same. It's to be scared of the other guy. We saw that with, Biden in 2020, vote for Biden or Trump will win again. And this time it was Biden and Kamala are so terrible, and this will be the end of the country as we know it if we don't vote Trump. It's the same tactic on either party to keep you in the box and choosing a candidate that has already shown to you what they are and what they will do when they are in power. And we can't keep doing that and expect different results at the end of the day. And, people.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to add that I really reject the idea that our only hope as a society is to vote for a lying politician that's a Democrat or a Republican every 4 years. That is not the only way to fix the country. And we're told that it is, and that if you don't vote for one guy, you must support the other guy. This is a paradigm we absolutely have to blow up. It makes no sense. And these people do not represent us. They show us time and again. And there has to be some sort of movement. The reason that Bernie Sanders was popular is because people want some sort of populist thing in government, populist changes, and that's a big reason for Trump's popularity as well. But it's all rhetoric with Trump, and it is apparently with a lot of these people, unfortunately. But something obviously Americans want some sort of populist change. They don't want the foreign wars, and we have to find a way to do that. And the way to do that is not to focus on political rhetoric. It's to focus on the actual policy and fight for the actual policy, or fight against policies we don't want. So I would argue we should stop focusing on the politician, on the rhetoric, and focus on the policy. If we want to end what's going on in Gaza, we focus on that and not what people are saying about it. People like Kamala talking out of both sides of their mouths, depending on what demographic they're trying to cater to. It should instead be focused on how do we affect real change there. Maybe people should look again at the BDS movement that people on the free speech Republican Party have tried to legislate out of existence and completely censor. And now, his head of DHS, Kristi Noem, seeking to, before she was appointed, she tried to essentially legislate equating criticism of the state of Israel, a government, a civil government, with anti-Semitism, which is absolutely not what it is at all, quite frankly. And, these things I think we should be concerned about, whether it's being pushed by either side. And again, as I said earlier, the same policies are pushed, the sales pitch are different. And it's very important in that case, we stop focusing on the sales pitches and focus on the policies so we can get the policies that represent us and that we want.
Yeah, your criticisms are so spot on, particularly your ability to make these really cogent right criticisms. It has me thinking about how if liberals for a second actually tried criticizing Trump and Republicans on the basis of the things that Trump's base actually cares about, as opposed to random lib nonsense. Oh, he filleted a microphone. He danced funny at a rally. His face is a weird color. He's a fascist. Maybe they wouldn't care, but it does seem to me like there would be a lot more of a needle movement, as it were, than the methods that they're taking on now, because the base does care about some things that I think are principled and that, to your point, there's bipartisan agreement on among voters. And Democrats' refusal to acknowledge that there's any there in conservative support blinds them to what they could actually be hitting Republicans on. I did want to ask you, and you brought it up just then, about Israel and the belief among some that Kamala Harris could be pushed. And I've been making the case that for really structural reasons, anybody who was in Kamala's position to potentially be the president of the United States of America could not be pushed because of the money they've received, because of the requirements from the deep state, from the three-letter agencies, it said from the security apparatus, that there is a certain kind of ideological commitment you have to make before coming in. I do wonder how you would frame it and whether you would deepen that analysis in certain ways and whether or not you give credence to some of the other sorts of theories about why it is that the American political sphere seems completely beholden to a country that has a tiny fraction of the wealth or military power of the wealthiest and strongest country in the world.
Yeah, so there's a lot of ways to answer that question. And I would encourage people, if they want the long form answer for this, you can read my book, One Nation Under Blackmail, where I talk about how I think this came to be. And the way I
Mm.
approach it in the book is what I try and do is explain how, first of all, the US intelligence apparatus formed. It was mostly Wall Street bankers and lawyers when it was the OSS, the precursor to the CIA during World War II. And then World War II era US military intelligence decided to team up with organized crime out of convenience and something known as Operation Underworld. And then when the CIA was created, they deepened that alliance with organized crime. And that's why you had so many people on CIA assassination squads and things like that also being organized crime figures from the United States. For example, there was a lot of overlap. And of course, there's a lot of overlap between Wall Street and organized crime, and the outsized influence of Wall Street on the early CIA and subsequent CIA, is something that's worth considering as well. And then when you consider how the intelligence and security agencies of Israel came to be, you have to look back and know that the precursor to these organizations, like the Haganah, Irgun, and these organizations, many of them were armed by the same organized crime networks in the United States. And so once Israel is established as a country and they formalize these paramilitary groups into actual agencies of the state, they kept a lot of those same networks alive and a lot of those same alliances alive. And a lot of these networks continue to wield extreme influence on our society and also Israeli society. But obviously in the Israel case, I think it's a little bit different when you consider the ideological influence of someone like Menachem Begin from the early 1970s and how he was influenced greatly by Zev Jabotinsky, who his inspiration for revision Zionism, now the dominant form of Zionism in Israel, was openly inspired by Benito Mussolini and said that this is what the Jewish state should be, essentially an ethno-fascism, basically at the end of the day. And obviously the way the United States developed was very different. The narrative, in the 70s and things like that was not like it was in Israel. There's obvious differences, but the important thing I'm trying to get at here is that the intelligence agencies were in bed with organized crime, a lot of them the same networks, and then the CIA and these Israeli security agencies have continued to team up with those organized crime networks and with each other for many years. And that's why some of the biggest intelligence scandals in US history jointly involve American and Israeli intelligence working together. Iran-Contra is a well-known and very good example of that, for example. And so I think that deep embedding of, between the CIA and Israeli intelligence agencies is one reason. It's also very clear to me that there has been the use of blackmail, sex blackmail against US politicians by Israel. But it's not exclusive to Israel ever. South Korea did it. The British did it. Different power factions, the United States did it to other power factions they were competing against. And this was really a tactic that was first developed by organized crime with great success for them, and then adopted by intelligence agencies and also other people that are not necessarily affiliated with them, but work with them, weapons dealers like Adnan Khashoggi, for example. They have used these types of tactics to great effect, and Israel has done that as well. And that is one likely possibility. There's also the Israel lobby, which is extremely powerful, and also this idea that you cannot criticize certain figures, including people that were, in the case of the Epstein scandal, the obvious patrons of Jeffrey Epstein, Leslie Wexner. No accountability for him, no criticism of him, no one will go after him. And you could argue it's because that his philanthropic, quote unquote, legacy is, things like the Wexner Fellowship and things like that. And most people that are now on the board of AIPAC are Wexner Fellows, or were at one point, and things like that. So, these people are very influential and apparently above criticism. And if you criticize some of these figures, that in the case of Leslie Wexner, his own local police department reported he was tied to the mob, you can't criticize that, or you can be accused of anti-Semitism by some of these big organizations like the Anti-Defamation League that has been funded historically by people like Wexner and also other figures tied to organized crime historically, like the Bronfman family, who came to prominence because of their dominance of the liquor industry in Canada, taking advantage of U.S. prohibition, and they used organized crime networks to traffic their liquor into the United States during prohibition, and basically took over the entire market once it was legalized because of those networks, and have, if you look at their history, have maintained a lot of those organized crime connections, whether in Canada or the United States, for many decades since, and even had their own sexual blackmail scandal of note with the Nexium scandal that sort of broke in the Epstein era. So there's a lot of, things that should be criticized there, but I think, people are wrong to conflate the actions of people like the Bronfmans or Leslie Wexner or Jeffrey Epstein, for example, with all Jewish people, or the crimes committed by the Israeli military or Israeli intelligence with all Jewish people. But this is being done to shield those actors from criticism. And I think that's why they've been able to do so much relative compared to other countries.
I've been curious when I listened to you talk about the Bronfmans. I didn't know anything about them. Can I confess? The reason I even know that name is because one of the Bronfman offspring, a woman named Hannah. Sorry, guys, I'm online and I have other interests.
Edgar Bronfman Jr.'s daughter.
She's an influencer, right? Like
yes.
I followed her years ago because she's a cute girl with cute clothes. She's that tier of the family, they're all half black. And then they came up again because I don't know if you remember this, at the Met Gala where AOC went famously in her Tax the Rich dress. The designer of her dress went with Hannah Bronfman's brother as a date. So there's a picture of them all like coming down the
right. Is that the same
steps
one
together?
That had a
Benjamin
child with
Bronfman.
Or...
Oh, did he? Oh, see,
well,
I love that
one of Hannah's siblings did. Yeah.
I love that you're a serious woman, but you'll also get down in this TMZ dirt with me for a second.
I just know pretty much everything there is to know about the Bronfmans at this point. So
who are they? Like, not, obviously some random offspring designing a dress for AOC is not necessarily some big smoking gun, but it is curious to me that these people are showing up everywhere. What should we know about the Bronfmans?
Well, there's a lot to say there. So basically, the first oligarch of the family was Sam Bronfman. The family came over from a country that was then called Bessarabia, but I forget exactly what country that is today. I think maybe Ukraine. And they settled in Canada, and they basically set it up so that they would be perfectly poised to dominate the market after U.S. prohibition was declared. And there was some weird, I talk about it all in my book and sort of about their rise to power. Sam Bronfman was also pretty closely associated with the guy named Louis Rosenstiel, who ended up becoming, who was also very linked to organized crime, and sort of was allowed to have really the first liquor company that became huge post-prohibition based in the United States. Seagram's, the Bronfman company, was based in Canada. And Louis Rosenstiel went on to be a mentor to Roy Cohn, and Roy Cohn went on to be a mentor to Donald Trump. And Roy Cohn, along with Louis Rosenstiel, were involved in sexual blackmail operations in the McCarthy era. He was a counsel to McCarthy and one of the, lead figures in deciding, who to go after as part of the McCarthy hearings, and allegedly brought about its downfall as well. Well, pretty much did. And the Bronfmans pretty much since then have had a lot of power in both the United States and Canada. So members of the Bronfman family, they really descend from two of Sam Bronfman's children. He had several children, but the two that really wielded the most influence after their father was Edgar Bronfman and Charles Bronfman. And Charles Bronfman went to form a group with Leslie Wexner in 1991. And at that time, Wexner was deeply involved with Jeffrey Epstein. They had a couple different names for it. They called it the Study Group. They called it the Mega Group. And the only report on it is from the Wall Street Journal in, I think, 1998. And there it lists the known members, and pretty much every single one of them has historical ties to organized crime. And they were basically concerned about the fact that the Jewish community in America was having relations outside of the Jewish community. They were concerned about sort of like dilution of the demographic, I guess you could say. And we're trying to find ways to have Jews marry Jews and things like that. So sort of focused on maintaining the ethnicity, I guess you could say, was their main focus. But the organized crime connections of all of them, I think, is kind of noteworthy of a couple of the other people there, like the Crown family, for example, who were influential in Chicago. They have run General Dynamics for a very long time, and the patriarch of that family also built up his company with the mob. And so a lot of these people have, successfully rebranded themselves as philanthropists. And I just want to say too, this came downstream of my investigation into Jeffrey Epstein. It is not to say that these are the only organized crime people that rebranded as philanthropists. It's not exclusive to just these people. But in the case of the Epstein network and looking at how he was allowed to operate for so long, you can't really avoid looking at people like Leslie Wexner and their connections. And there also are ties between the Bronfmans and Epstein as well. Allegedly, the reason Epstein had to leave Bear Stearns was because of his involvement in a Bronfman insider trading scandal. There's a lot of things Edgar Bronfman was involved with on and off. A lot of involvement with the Bank of New York, which later became, got involved with money laundering for the Russian mob in the 1990s when there was all this capital flight after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And a lot of these accusations that were levied at Trump later on through Russiagate and all of that about this period really don't trace back to Russia. They trace back to organized crime figures, mainly Simeon Mogilevich, who actually was very close to people like Robert Maxwell and had a lot of ties to the state of Israel and things of that nature. And also, their movement of money was facilitated in part by the Bronfman family. So, these are networks that, a lot of these oligarchs have relationships with intelligence agencies or foreign governments, and have relationships with unsavory banks and are able to operate, above the purview of the law. And I think that's, a big reason why people like Epstein were allowed to operate with impunity for some time, and why a lot of these people, as billionaires, don't really have their business interests properly scrutinized when maybe it should be,
Okay, first of all, you have incredible recall, like Max Blumenthal levels of recall. I'm incredibly impressed by it. Two, I actually think you would do, for what it's worth, very well on a platform like Rumble, and Rumble would really benefit from hearing your perspective, because there's a real appetite, I think, for people who are knowledgeable about these issue areas. And I think sometimes the interest in the issue area is confused with an attraction to a perspective within that issue area. But sure. I do think that what is attractive, and I think someone like, well, I think that would benefit from you, whatever you choose to do going forward. But the third thing I do want to ask,
I don't really make video content though. I'm mostly a writer, which I know a lot of people don't read anymore. So that's the main reason I do interviews and I talk about this stuff. But it's not really like my medium. But because of how things have changed and how people consume media has changed, I may not really have a choice but to focus mainly on video.
And this is what I'm saying. Like, get yourself a little $100 teleprompter that you can put, or use an app on your computer and read it off your computer, and just read your article into the camera. And honestly, like, the appetite, I know for a fact, is there. I saw your interview with Sabby got an insane number of views. people want to hear from you, and I'm really grateful to have you here. I don't want to keep you too long. I know we've already gone well over the hour, but we have said, sex blackmail a bunch of times. And I think people are broadly very familiar with the Jeffrey Epstein story. But there are these sensitivities that you alluded to before about, making an overly broad characterization of some of this, the sex crimes or the organized crimes as quote unquote Jewish crimes. And so I was also interested in you saying like that this sort of thing has other historical parallels in, did you say Korea, and did you say somewhere else?
Blackmail. Yeah, sure.
Sexual blackmail, sorry. Yeah, can you give us some context for what that is, what it looks like in different contexts, and then maybe drill down on how you think it's affecting the U.S. relationship to Israel?
You mean on the history of sex blackmail broadly speaking?
Yeah.
So a lot of those specific examples in the detail I'm a little rusty on because it's been about 3 years since I wrote that part of the book. But basically there was a major scandal, sex scandal around this place called the Georgetown Club in Washington, D.C. And it was basically being run as a club where like illegal drugs were available and, sex sometime, with people was taking place, and this stuff, the place was bugged. It was being filmed, right? And so the people that were essentially operating that were affiliates of the Korean Central Intelligence Agency, was just South Korea's Central Intelligence Agency. But I mean, those people also had CIA connections too. Some of the people involved also had ties to the Nixon administration. Was it a joint CIA, KCIA operation? It's hard to know. Another good example, I suppose, would be the Profumo affair, which was mainly based in the United Kingdom, I guess, but also the people that were involved in blackmailing British politicians. It's named for the Profumo affair because I believe the Secretary of Defense was brought down by the scandal because he was involved in sexual activity with one of the main operatives of this particular group, which was tied to organized crime and some of these
So
groups.
it's just regular legal sex that people are being blackmailed with, as opposed to Epstein?
But if they're married to someone, and we're talking about the 1960s, that can end a career, right? Or in the case of
petite affaire. Okay,
well,
all right.
well, there's also the case of, in the United States in that same era, there were also sexual blackmail operations being run, like the one I mentioned involving Lewis Rosenstein and Roy Cohn earlier, where they were setting up men with underage men. And in this area where homosexuality is a societal taboo still, it's absolutely career ending, especially if you're in the military or in public office. J. Edgar Hoover also allegedly involved in his connections to organized crime and figures like that. And the reason the FBI never prosecuted organized crime, why he was running the FBI, which was for a long part of its history, is very likely connected to those associations, right? So it has had a significant influence, I think, on U.S. history. And I'm sure there's plenty of sexual blackmail cases that we still don't know about that may have happened and totally been swept under the rug. For example, one of the main women involved in compromising politicians for the Profumo affair, she was brought to New York by some British television executive, I believe, and alleged to have slept with JFK. And then she was deported essentially to the UK, whisked away on some official British ship. And the FBI had her little black book, her client list, and just destroyed it and never released it. Right. So there's interesting stories like this that are very similar to the Epstein case that have really happened throughout American history. And the fact that, our federal law enforcement branch like the FBI would so routinely work to cover it up, I think is problematic. But if you understand people like J. Edgar Hoover, for example, who created that agency essentially and ran it for several decades, and if they were tied to organized crime, they're obviously going to selectively prosecute and selectively protect certain things. And if you're organized crime, essentially what you want to do is have more rackets and expand them and have them never be caught or stopped so you can make the maximum amount of money illegally. And if you have state protection, then you can do that very effectively. And so that's why I think it's important to consider the evidence I lay out for this sort of meeting of organized crime and intelligence agencies, because a lot of the rackets that used to be of organized crime, sex trafficking, drug trafficking, arms trafficking, how many intelligence scandals just in U.S. history have been our three-letter agencies doing those exact same things? And who are they really benefiting, right? So there's a lot more to say about that. If you're interested in all the intersections of that, you can read my books, but just a warning, they are pretty dense. Because I'm basically trying to show how these same people engaged in the same patterns of criminality, including in creating a lot of our financial crises historically, including the savings and loans crisis, for example, in the 1980s. And a lot of these same people that were in those networks ended up helping create the 2008 financial crisis and so on and so on. These are important stories and important networks that people need to understand, and people need to understand how they operate, and that it's not really a partisan thing. This is a bipartisan issue. And this is why I go back to what I said earlier about how I think it's so troubling that there's this effort to frame the quote unquote deep state as a purely partisan thing, because it's absolutely bipartisan. And if people really want these unaccountable agencies to either be dismantled or reined in or something, you have to know what's actually going on, and you have to know how to actually do that and who could actually do that. And I am, based on my work, am not confident that the current administration will do that. I think instead they're trying to redefine whatever deep state means so that the people they decide to quote unquote take down will be seen by their base as that, when in reality, that's not what's going on.
Yeah, I was going to ask you what you make of the sort of defund the FBI movement that Marjorie Taylor Greene's sort of spoken to existence.
Yeah.
Matt Gaetz, I've seen some chatter about, well, he's been a defund the FBI guy in the past, I think. What does it mean for him to be attorney general? It's complicated, right? Because while I don't have any great faith that they're going to do anything for myriad reasons, they're going to have to negotiate the fact that they did say these things and now they're in actual positions of power.
Well,
what do you expect to see?
I think it's possible they might try and do something like that. I think either side is possible, but what I think is likely if they do defund these agencies is that they'll do something similar to what Javier Milei has proposed doing in Argentina. And I think his government has been sort of a beta test for some of these policies that I think are possible, not necessarily likely, but should be considered as possible during an incoming Trump administration. And as an example, Milei has pitched eliminating the Ministry of Education in Argentina, and then said that he would replace it with Facebook's AI would teach people in Argentina.
What?
Right? And then framing that as libertarian, as efficient. Now we have Elon Musk, who has visited Javier Milei many times, presumably for Argentina's lithium, but perhaps other things as well, running a Department of Government Efficiency. And I think that might be a way to sort of eliminate governments. People will claim, on popular agencies, people will claim, look, Trump is dismantling the deep state, but then you can just replace it with AI or some of
the
these
Department of Education is the deep state?
Well, no, well, in the case of Milei,
yeah, go ahead.
Well, in the case of Milei, he campaigned and said it's really a department of indoctrination and all of these things, and framed himself as taking on the establishment. But actually, he brought in, he didn't bring in anti-establishment people. He brought on people from the previous right-leaning administration of Mauricio Macri, and then as having most of those people run things under the guise of it being anti-establishment. But he is planning to, and in some cases has, shut down aspects of the government. But his pitch for replacing them is to replace them with American Silicon Valley companies, some of which have ties to American intelligence agencies. Is that really any better? And is it really better to replace major aspects of our society with unproven, poorly tested, and often overhyped AI algorithms? Because remember, it's an industry. A lot of times they overhype their products. They'll say they're 80% effective, but that's the company's sales pitch. It hasn't been independently vetted. Should we be giving major things that departments or powers that determine how people live their lives or have major impacts on people's lives to an AI algorithm of a particular company? And it's complicated, but I think the way it might be what they might try and do. Because ultimately, I feel like a lot of what runs the country and much of the countries in the world, it's the public-private partnership model. And so if people get disgusted enough with the public sector, they do ping pong like they do between Democrats and Republicans, and they'll take us from the public to the private. And so I think it's very possible that there may be an effort to sort of hoodwink people that are right-leaning and really hoping for populist change into thinking that something fundamentally different will happen. But this is how we sort of get like an AI-run techno-feudal society, by putting the algorithm in charge of everything. And this is kind of actually predicted to an extent in this very unusual book that was co-authored by Henry Kissinger and Eric Schmidt about the future of AI, and basically talked about once we outsource enough stuff to AI and put it charge in government and all of this stuff, we will lose the ability to govern ourselves and even think for ourselves if we outsource all of our thinking to AI and all of our decision making to AI under the guise of, if you don't use something, you lose it. So if you stop doing mental math and use a calculator for years, you'll forget how to do mental math. And they essentially argue that that's what will happen when we outsource all of our decision making to AI. And if you have government push for that, or say they're going to downsize government and replace it with algorithms, effectively that could unfortunately become a reality. And again, I think they're going to frame it in sort of these terms like they've been, I think, testing out with Milei, and frame sort of these destruction of these public sector agencies as real change. But what will they be replacing them with? And will it actually be any better? Or will it lead us into sort of this techno-feudal nightmare,
Whitney, if everything understood if everybody understood what you've explained to us today, like if we had perfect information and you were given a primetime MSNBC or Fox show and you were able to unreservedly
never
tell
get
your
that,
truth
but
for you.
thanks.
Obviously. But we're doing a fantasy thought experiment here. If everyone understood what you've explained here today, what do you think would happen? Do you think it would be enough that people sort of understanding the way they're being manipulated by both parties, but in the context of what we're talking about today, conservatives being led to believe that there's going to be real reforms from a second Trump administration and the like, Democrats realizing the extent to which their party is complicit equally. Do you think that would be enough to get people to divest? And if not, what do you think sort of needs to happen?
I would hope so, but I think unfortunately people are looking for saviors. People look for political saviors. If we get the right guy in the White House, he can fix everything and solve all of our problems. And I think they look for those saviors too in media. This person says what I like. And so, you should run for president in 2028 and all of this stuff, or I'm going to believe whatever they say.
Left.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
or I'm going to believe whatever you say. And because I trusted you this one time, I'm going to suspend critical thought and believe everything you said. I think that paradigm needs to change. It's a problem in media. It's a problem in politics. And I think people, again, need to stop looking for saviors and hoping that these people put in front of us, often by moneyed networks that have the ability to put people in front of us on a massive level. I think we should be looking more locally, really, and realize that we are the saviors we have been waiting for. We are able to affect real change. And that's why so much effort has been put in to distract us, to have us focus on these other people, and also to make us feel powerless and alone, depending on what's going on in the world and what our viewpoint is and what we're opposing or supporting. And I think, again, social media is a very manipulated medium. I think people need to probably spend a little more time offline and talking to real people, socializing, organizing in real life, and trying to affect change in your local community, which you actually can have a say over, unlike perhaps the federal level of the U.S. national government, right? And that we should also be putting a lot of our energy there and not putting all of our energy and all of our attention on these political saviors that are in, the figureheads of political parties that we know are very corrupt. And I think it starts with us, and it starts with us realizing that the paradigms we have been told, or really, that have been sort of culturally put upon us, that we should shed them and that they're part of the problem.
You heard that, listeners. Whitney Webb says, log off, nerds. And I am
or at least take a break.
touch grass. Yeah, look, I've been feeling that a lot. I have had opportunities with my trip to Santa Barbara to do this conference that Butch Ware put on with the Green Party, with other organizers that I've met recently. That has been really sinking in, especially in the political context that we're in, not just because of the election, but frankly, the sort of malaise that I felt in the Biden era and the constant, discussions that feel like tinkering around the edges and trying to make a very basic case for what's not working. I'm ready to make an affirmative case for what does work and get back into the real world. And I really appreciate that closing advice from you. People should definitely check out One Nation Under Blackmail. I have I'm not going to get it from Amazon, but I have a window open right now and to remind myself to go and get it myself. Where can people find you, Whitney, on the internet and beyond? And if you have any recommendations for where they should buy your book, you can let them know that as well.
Sure. Well, you can buy direct from the publisher, which is Trine, Trine. And that way you don't have to give Jeff Bezos any money, which is preferable. But you can also go to my website, unlimitedhangout.com, to find all of my written work and articles, and also of other people that contribute to my website. And there's also information about where to purchase the book and how to support my work if you feel so inclined.
Please do. I mean, Whitney, you are really doing incredible, detailed journalism here, and that does not get affirmed and supported enough. So if this was at all interesting to you, which I know that it must be, please do consider ordering Whitney's book and at least subscribing, following, supporting her on her website in any way that you can, if you can. And if you are not able to do so financially, retweets and likes and things like that are very helpful to distribute people's content. So please help her out in that way. Whitney Webb, thank you so much for being with me. And I hope you come back soon.
Thank you. My pleasure. I'd love to come back on. Thanks.
All right. To the audience, take care of yourselves. You know that you can find an additional episode of Bad Faith Podcast every week on Mondays at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. And as always, keep the faith.
Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you, and as always, keep the faith.